in this video, I'm going to listen to an excerpt. We're going to listen to an excerpt from a debate on the Justin Brierley's radio show Unbelievable from 10 years ago, from I believe it was April 2011, between Paul Copan and an atheist named Norman Bachrach on the issue of Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster? And I think that the clip that we're going to play is important because it shows how Copan avoids dealing with the central issue that was raised by Bachrach. Now, whether or not you think it's disingenuous, the way that Copan handles the question is another issue. But I do think that he really, in a sense, stonewalls or obfuscates the issue. He sort of clouds it by rather than dealing directly with the issue. And this is something that I certainly sought to address in my book, Jesus Loves Canaanites, where I devoted a chapter to the views of people like Copan, including himself. And I called it the just war interpreters, people who try to interpret the destruction, the conquest of Canaan within the rubric of a contemporary just war theory. And I argue that that utterly fails. And what you in fact have in the text is constitutive of ethnic cleansing and indeed of genocide. But at this point, we want to just listen to the clip. I'm going to begin by playing at the point where Bachrach is just concluding the objections that he's raised, which include violence against children. And then Justin Brierley, the host, steps in, and he nicely summarizes the issue by citing from Joshua chapter 6, verses 20 and 21, which talks about the destruction of all the residents of the city, including men and women, young and old, as well as animals. And then we turn it over to Copan to offer a response to this issue. In particular, again, the killing, the slaughter of children, infants, small children. And so listen closely to how Copan responds, and then we'll come back and discuss it afterwards.
And then you say they would go to heaven anyway. So these are your justifications for when children are killed by the battles that had to take place.
Let's give some context to this. Let me just read briefly from, for instance, Joshua, the story. It's a Sunday school story, isn't it? You know, Joshua marching around with his troops, the city of Jericho, and the walls fall down. Now, what isn't so often focused upon in the Sunday school class is you know, what you would find in Joshua chapter 6 verses, here we are, 21. Which follows, then they devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep and donkeys. I mean, it is a picture of sort of wiping out everyone, children included. And I think for a lot of people, while they could see the argument that people doing things wrong perhaps deserve judgment in the eyes of God, Paul, how could that possibly apply to children, to babies, to, you know, how do we get around this particular issue?
Okay, so I think I really appreciate the way that Justin Brierley, who's a pro at this, he steps in there and he quotes directly from Joshua chapter 6. Again, men, women, young, old, babies. How do we get around the idea that God commanded the slaughter of babies? Now, keep in mind, the Israelites, the implements that they used here were primarily swords and spears. So what we're talking about is young children fleeing, infants lying on the ground, squirming, crying, and then having swords, hacking them into pieces, having spears plunged through their abdomens, sometimes perhaps being bludgeoned to death with other implements like clubs or rocks or bricks. How do you explain this? That's the question before Copan. That's what we're talking about, right? The slaughter of children, which is really quite explicitly referenced, young and old. Young includes children, right? So that's what we have to address. Let's listen to how Copan responds.
Yeah, well, I think, again, putting this issue in even broader context, I would argue that
Okay, I'm sorry, I just have to intervene here. I promise I'm not going to keep doing this, but right there you see I'm going to say a trick. What you see is a maneuver, and the maneuver is Copan says, well, let's put this into broader context. No, let's talk about the issue at hand. The issue at hand is killing children, which is explicitly referenced in Joshua chapter 6. Justin Brierley just quoted it. How do you explain that? But I mean, it's a good rhetorical strategy in a debate, as Copan is doing here. He's deflecting from the question by proposing to address a broader context than actually to address the question that has been posed to him.
In the, that is kind of a fallback position. What I argue, my primary argument, is that the texts of Joshua or Deuteronomy are hyperbolized texts which were kind of standard fare in the ancient Near East. You could have someone win by a narrow margin. In fact, one Moabite king had an inscription that said, Israel is no more. Now we know, actually Moab is no more, not Israel is no more. There were, but that was the level of exaggeration that was standard in ancient Near Eastern war texts. And Israel, the war texts of Israel are no exception. Let me give you an example. In Joshua 11:22, it says there were no Anakim left in the land. Well, then, and it says in chapter 11 also that they were utterly destroyed in the hill country. But yet, 3 chapters later, Caleb asked permission to drive out the Anakites from the hill country. And so what you have is, yes, the language of wiping out, leaving alive nothing that breathes, but then you have the language of lots of survivors being left.
Okay, now here's another thing to note, that Copan just introduced new language, leave alive nothing that breathes. That's language from Deuteronomy chapter 20. What was actually in the topic of conversation was not Deuteronomy 20, which arguably does have this formulaic language. It was the language of Joshua chapter 6, verses 20 and 21. So what Copan then is saying is, well, Joshua 6, 20 and 21 is when it says that they killed everyone, all the men, all the women, all the young, all the old. Copan is saying, well, that could have been hyperbole. It could have been exaggeration. Maybe they didn't kill all of them. Even if that's the case, how many of them did they kill? How many of the children did they kill? That's the question. We want to talk about the ethics of slaughtering children and infants. And don't keep deflecting from it. But he's deflecting from it by switching the conversation to Deuteronomy 20 and to a general conversation about the use of hyperbole in war rhetoric. Fine, there may be hyperbole in Joshua 6. Maybe it's Copan's view that they didn't kill all of the people of Jericho, although honestly, the text gives no hint that that specific language is hyperbolic. It does quite clearly say that at least in Jericho, yes, everybody was killed. But even if everybody wasn't killed, and Copan is right about the use of hyperbole here, you still have to deal with the fact that an indeterminate number of children were butchered, were impaled with spears, were hacked apart with swords. That's the question.
And the main thrust is that the language is of driving out the Canaanites, driving them out. Displacement is the language rather than slaughter. In fact, when Adam and Eve are driven out of the garden, it is not that they are killed when they are driven out of the garden. The language is far more numerous of the references to dispossessing or driving out are far more numerous than slaughter or destruction or something like that. And I guess I would just encourage the critics to be fair to that kind of language. If you use the language of driving out, then we're not talking about utterly destroying. Secondly,
okay, he says secondly, but actually he's made 2 distinct points here. The first point was on the use of hyperbole, of exaggeration for effect, and the second point is on the primacy, in Copan's view, of language of driving out rather than language of mass slaughter. So I've already dealt with hyperbole. Let me just talk about that second point as regards the use of driving out. Okay, but the point here is that in Joshua chapter 6, we're not talking about driving out of the city. We're talking about killing everyone in the city. This is the text he's been asked about. He's been asked about the reference in chapter 6, verse 20 and 21 about killing all, young and old, as well as men and women. So women, non-combatant women, children, and infants. That's the conversation, not the language about driving out. Another thing I would note is that the language of driving out, charitably interpreted, is still ethnic cleansing. So Copan is still committed to a view of ethnic cleansing of the land. And then a third point I would make is what Copan doesn't want to address, I'm sure, is what happens to all the people who are being driven out, but they fail to outrun the armies of Israel. Well, of course, they would be slaughtered. So Copan is just doing the best he can to avoid addressing the salient question that has been posed to him. What about the slaughter, the butchering of children and infants?
what we are also noting is that God is primarily concerned about disabling the moral and religious structures of the Canaanites. That, for example, in Deuteronomy chapter 7, it uses the language of wiping them out, of destroying and so forth, but then it says, do not intermarry with them in the next verse. Do not make covenants with them and so forth, so that you won't fall into the practices of these Canaanites. That was the primary motivation. God is concerned not so much about wiping out Canaanites as he is about disabling the moral and religious structures of the Canaanite people, so that there would be a moral and theological preparation for the coming of the Messiah. So,
all right, so we can stop there. Copan's third, and not his second point, as he said, but rather his third point, is about the idea that, well, really the focus here is on disabling. Note how he uses the word disable, which is a euphemism, as I hope you can appreciate. The real intent here was not to quote unquote disable, it's to destroy, it's to eradicate, it's to wipe off the face of the earth. Now, he does rightly note that there is a focus in a passage like Deuteronomy 7 on not killing Canaanites per se as such, but rather destroying the culture, not just disabling, but destroying the culture of Canaan. But here's the interesting thing. The end goal of eradicating or destroying a cultural religious identity, that's what genocide is. Genocide, by definition, is the attempt to eradicate a conceptual genos, a conceptual kind, whether it be a religious or cultural or ethnic identity. Now, obviously, one way to destroy an identity, a cultural understanding of who one is, one way to do that is to kill people who exemplify that cultural or ethnic or religious identity. Killing them will definitely do that. But there are other ways, such as destroying all of their cultural implements, performing an ethnic cleansing, and driving them by force out of a land. Actions like that are, if they are undertaken with the intent of destroying Canaanite culture, not just disabling it, then by definition, it's genocide. That's what genocide is. All you have to do is look up the UN definition of genocide. So with that in mind, I think Copan's arguments about hyperbole he throws out there, and then about driving out of the land, and then about, well, it's not about killing Canaanites, it's about disabling their culture, which is actually about destroying their culture, which is genocide. I don't think any of that looks very good. But the main point to keep in mind here is that he gives like a 2.5, 3-minute response to the question. But the question was about Joshua chapter 6, verses 20 and 21, that the Israelite army came in and they killed everyone in the city, men and women, young and old. Now, Copan can argue that that's hyperbole, but even if he says it's hyperbole, which in respect, this text doesn't say that everyone in Canaan was hyperbole, that was killed in in Jericho was hyperbole. But even if he does say that, you still have an indeterminate number of infants and children being slaughtered and butchered under the divine command. And that is what he is obliged to explain. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that this, to my mind, is really a debate maneuver. And it does get into a kind of difficult question at this point. At what point is somebody being intellectually dishonest with their audience by obfuscating, which I believe Copan is doing here? I think he's clearly obfuscating. He's deflecting. He doesn't want to address the central question about child slaughter, which has been proposed to him. And so he's talking about these other things, talking about Deuteronomy 20, talking about Deuteronomy 7, talking about hyperbole and the primacy of driving out of the land back to the garden in Genesis chapter 3. All of that, I think, is a way of avoiding the question that's been posed to him. So at what point is that intellectually dishonest? At what point is a person being deceptive? And I don't know. I mean, it's always possible that Copan kind of forgot what the question was and he just went off on a tear and talked about other things. But I can't help but think that Copan is a smart person. He's an intelligent person, intelligent debater, an effective debater. And to my mind, it's really that there's more technique involved here than just kind of forgetting his train of thought and failing to address the question. It's like a politician who says, let me be very clear, when he's given a hard question, and then he gives a long answer that doesn't actually address the question that's been posed to him. And it is intellectually dishonest. I think we need to call it out as that. And the longer that you perpetuate these kinds of, I think, intellectually dishonest responses to honest questions as a way to prop up a traditional way of reading the biblical genocide text of Joshua and Deuteronomy, I think that you then just perpetuate misunderstanding in the wider Christian community, which allows those, I think, indefensible readings to continue to be propagated within the church. So I think that we really need to have an honest conversation. And when people ask you about killing men and women, young and old, all of the residents of the city of Jericho, you better be ready to give an honest and direct response. And if you can't in good conscience, with your moral compass within you, give a response to that, perhaps that is the point where you need to rethink your theology.